It began like any ordinary afternoon, except it wasn't. Because what happened on that park bench in the heart of San Francisco would spark a chain reaction no one could have predicted. Not the officer, not the bystanders, and certainly not the man who would soon be recognized as someone far more important than anyone had imagined. Golden Gate Park was serene that day, its broad tree-lined paths bathed in the golden haze of a late summer sun. Children laughed in the distance. Cyclists passed with ease. A breeze rustled through eucalyptus branches, blending the scent of earth and sea. Sitting on a weathered green bench near the reflecting pond was a man dressed in a slate-gray pullover, dark jeans, and well-worn boots. He looked ordinary, calm. His shoulders relaxed, a paperback novel resting in his lap. His name was Elias Monroe. To any passerby, he might have seemed like a professor on sabbatical, or a writer chasing quiet. His gaze moved slowly across the page, but every so often, his eyes flicked upward, surveying his surroundings. Subtle, discreet, trained. What Elias didn't know was that across the footpath, Officer Chad Rylance had been watching him. Officer Rylance had worked the Haight District for nearly 17 years. He liked to think he had good instincts, what he called a sixth sense for trouble. But his instincts weren't always neutral. And today, something about Elias rubbed him the wrong way. Or rather, something about Elias didn't fit the image Officer Rylance was comfortable with. A black man, alone, calm, seated in one of the wealthiest areas of the city with nothing but a book for company. Rylance's eyes narrowed. He whispered something into his radio, though there was no immediate need. Then, with the casual certainty of a man who expected his authority to be enough, he crossed the footpath and approached the bench. Elias looked up. He knew. He didn't have to guess. The slow gait, the fixed stare, the clipped breath. It was all familiar. This wasn't the first time he'd been mistaken for something he wasn't. But today, something felt different. He closed his book, slipped a finger between the pages to mark his place, and waited. "Afternoon," Rylance said. His tone was polite, almost too polite, like civility hanging by a thread. Elias nodded. "Afternoon. You live around here?" Elias met his eyes. "Is there a reason you're asking?" Rylance tilted his head slightly, his hand casually resting near the baton on his belt. "Just doing my rounds. You seemed out of place." That phrase. Elias had heard it before, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, but always meaning the same thing. "I'm reading a book, in a public park, on my day off." Rylance's jaw tightened. "Can I see some ID?" Elias sighed softly and looked past him, out toward the fountain where a white couple was feeding ducks with their toddler. No ID had been requested from them. He returned his gaze to the officer. "Am I under suspicion of a crime?" "You're not cooperating," Rylance replied. "I'm not obligated to show ID without cause." And just like that, the air changed. Rylance took a step closer. "Stand up. I haven't done anything wrong. Stand up." The command rang out louder this time, drawing a few cautious stares from passers-by. Elias remained seated for one more breath, then slowly rose from the bench, his hands clearly visible. No sudden movements, no defiance, just calculated calm. That's what his training had taught him. Stay composed, especially when the situation gets unjust. Rylance didn't hesitate. He reached for his cuffs. "You're detaining me?" "You're resisting identification." Elias chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You're about to make a mistake." Rylance gripped his arm. "Turn around." The cuffs clicked shut with mechanical finality. Elias didn't flinch. He looked out over the park once more, the kids playing tag near the sculpture garden, the tourists snapping photos, the elderly woman with a sketch pad beneath the cypress tree. All of it carried on like nothing had happened. Except something had. A black man had been arrested for sitting still. No threat, no altercation, no crime. And the man now in cuffs was not only innocent, he was also not who the officer believed him to be. As Rylance led Elias toward the squad car parked along Kezar Drive, a few more bystanders began to whisper. A young woman pulled out her phone. A jogger stopped mid-stride, sensing something was off. But Rylance didn't care. He was in control, or so he thought. Inside the patrol car, Elias remained silent. He watched the trees pass through the window, watched as the sunlight flickered across the dashboard. Rylance glanced at him in the mirror, suddenly uncertain. "You sure you don't have anything on you I should know about?" he asked. Elias didn't respond. "You fit the description," Rylance muttered. Still no answer. And then, finally, Elias spoke. "You should check my ID. Again. Carefully." Rylance scoffed, but pulled the wallet from the evidence bag. He opened it, flipping past the license. And then his eyes froze. There, tucked neatly behind the state-issued ID, was a badge. Federal. Embossed. Unmistakable. Special Agent Elias Monroe. FBI. The silence in the car was deafening. It wasn't just embarrassment that hit Officer Rylance. It was something colder. A realization that he had just violated the rights of someone with far more authority than him. And more importantly, someone who knew exactly what that violation meant. Elias watched him in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "Now do you see me?" he asked quietly. The words landed like a weight. Rylance didn't answer. He couldn't. The patrol car kept driving, but the road ahead would not be as smooth. Not for the officer, not for the department, not for a system that had once again mistaken silence for weakness and presence for threat. This wasn't over. In fact, it was only the beginning. The ride to the precinct was quiet, but tension pulsed between them like static in the air. Officer Rylance kept glancing in the rearview mirror, stealing uneasy looks at the man he had just cuffed, who now sat silently in the back seat, composed, his eyes not filled with fear, but with something heavier. Disappointment. A weight Rylance couldn't quite name, but it settled between his shoulders all the same. He didn't say a word. Neither did Elias. The badge, the one he'd overlooked, the one tucked neatly behind a driver's license, had said everything that needed to be said. Still, Rylance hadn't turned the car around. Whether it was pride, confusion, or panic, he drove on toward the precinct with the same mechanical detachment he had used for 1,000 other arrests. But this one wasn't the same. He knew it. And deep down, Elias knew it too. When they arrived, the front desk sergeant lifted his eyebrows as Elias stepped out of the patrol car, his hands still cuffed. "Who's this?" he asked, curious, maybe even skeptical. "Detainment from Golden Gate Park," Rylance said quickly. "Suspicious behavior." The sergeant gave Elias a longer look, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Name?" Rylance handed over the ID without a word. The sergeant looked down, read the name, and blinked. Then again. And then slowly, his eyes rose to meet Elias's face, a flicker of recognition dawning. "You're kidding," he muttered under his breath. Rylance didn't respond. The sergeant stood a little straighter, clearing his throat. "Agent Monroe, I'm sorry. Please come with me." The cuffs came off fast. But Elias didn't rub his wrists. He didn't shout. He didn't ask for explanations. He simply followed the sergeant through the familiar corridors, past bulletin boards and tired officers sipping coffee, to an office near the back. There was a knock. Then a pause. Then the door opened. Chief Dana Haskins looked up from a file. She was a woman not easily rattled. 20 years on the force had given her a steady, hardened presence. But when she saw Elias standing in her doorway, her composure faltered for just a breath. "Agent Monroe," she said, rising. "I didn't expect to see you here today. Certainly not like this." "Neither did I," Elias replied, his voice calm, but weighted. She nodded toward the chair across from her desk. "Sit." He did. Outside the window, the sun had begun to lower behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Inside, the silence sat thick between them until she finally spoke. "I just got a call from Washington. I figured you might. They confirmed your ID and your clearance. They also asked me how one of their top field agents ended up in cuffs, in a city where he was assigned to assist with counterintelligence operations." Her words hung in the air, sharp but not cruel. Elias could hear the edge of frustration, not directed at him, but at what his presence now forced her to confront. "I wasn't undercover," Elias said. "I wasn't on a case. I was on personal time." Haskins exhaled. "Jesus." There was a pause. "I need to know what happened," she said. "Not the report, not the radio call. I want to hear it from you." So Elias told her. Not in anger, not as a lecture, but plainly, factually, the questions, the demands, the assumption, the phrase "out of place," the refusal to back down even after the badge was shown. Every detail. When he finished, she sat back in her chair, her jaw set. "I'm going to speak with Officer Rylance directly," she said, "but I'd like to hear your recommendation too. You've got the seniority, and frankly, the authority." But Elias didn't speak right away. Instead, he leaned forward, fingers laced. "Let me ask you something, Chief. If I didn't have that badge, how far would it have gone?" She didn't answer. "Would I have been booked? Fingerprinted? Thrown into holding with no call? How many people in this city don't get to pull out a federal ID and force someone to stop?" Still, she remained quiet. "That's the part that won't make the report," Elias continued. "Not the mistake, not the misunderstanding, but the pattern, the quiet belief, baked into the system, that someone like me doesn't belong in that park unless I'm in a uniform, or out of sight." Chief Haskins looked down at her desk. She was a white woman who had spent decades trying to do the right thing. But this was a moment that demanded more than procedural review. It demanded truth, and truth made people uncomfortable. "You're right," she finally said. "And we both know this wasn't about protocol." Elias nodded slowly. "Then let's not pretend it was." There was a long silence between them, but not a hostile one, just honest. Elias had sat in hundreds of rooms like this. Interview rooms, conference rooms, crisis rooms, and the pattern never changed. People saw his badge before they saw him. And when the badge was hidden, they saw everything they feared instead. "I don't want Rylance fired," Elias said at last. "Not yet." Haskins raised an eyebrow. "I want him to sit in a room and face what he did. Not to me. To the image he's been trained to react to. I want him to hear my file read aloud, every clearance level, every commendation, every time I've risked my life for a country that still sees my skin as a warning sign." Her eyes softened. "You want him to learn." "I want him to understand," Elias corrected. "There's a difference." She nodded. "Then I'll make it happen." Elias stood. "Thank you, Chief. I'm not angry. Just tired." She walked around the desk and offered her hand. "You shouldn't have to carry this. Not today. Not ever." Elias shook it firmly. "And yet I do." As he left the office, the hallway felt longer than before. Officers glanced up as he passed. Some curious, some uneasy. None of them said a word. But Elias didn't need their words. He'd learned long ago how to read silence. And this one? It wasn't neutral. It was the beginning of reckoning. The room where it would all unfold wasn't particularly grand. It wasn't built for statements that could echo beyond its walls. It was a conference space. 4 gray walls, a long table, and a whiteboard that hadn't been written on in weeks. But that day, it held something heavier than strategy plans or budget forecasts. It held a reckoning. Chief Dana Haskins had made good on her word. Less than 24 hours after Elias Monroe had walked out of her office, she assembled what she called a non-disciplinary debrief, though everyone knew it was more than that. It was unprecedented. A federal agent voluntarily initiating a sit-down with a local patrol officer who had wrongfully arrested him. Without lawyers, without media, without theatrics. Just truth. Officer Rylance sat near the end of the table, his posture straighter than usual, but his face drawn with the kind of fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying shame you didn't see coming. Across from him sat Elias, his expression unreadable. Not cold, not kind, just still. Chief Haskins opened the meeting, her voice low and firm. "We're here today not to assign punishment, but to seek understanding. Agent Monroe has requested a conversation. A candid one. Officer Rylance, you've agreed to listen. Rylance nodded, not looking up. Yes, Chief. Then I'll step out and let you speak freely, she said, rising. But I'll be just outside. And with that, the door closed, leaving them alone. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Elias leaned back slightly, folding his hands in front of him. I'm not here to humiliate you, he began, or demand an apology you don't mean. What I need, what we need, is honesty. Rylance swallowed hard. I don't even know where to begin. Then start with what you saw, Elias replied. Not what you did. What you saw when you looked at me in that park. Rylance hesitated. His knuckles whitened where his hands gripped each other. I saw someone who didn't fit the scene. Someone sitting alone, calm, watching. I thought, maybe you were scoping something. I don't know. My instincts kicked in. Your instincts, Elias repeated. The same ones that told you a black man sitting on a bench with a book was suspicious. Rylance looked up, shame crawling across his face. It sounds bad when you say it like that. It is bad, Elias replied, without venom. But I'm not here to crucify you. I'm here to make you see what I've spent my whole life navigating. You were trained to see calm as dangerous, confidence as threatening, silence as guilt, when it's coming from someone who looks like me. Rylance's eyes began to gloss over, not from self-pity, but from the kind of clarity that burns when it finally lands. I didn't mean for it to go that far, he said. I didn't know who you were. I thought I was following my gut. That's the problem, Elias said quietly. Your gut was trained by a system that doesn't see the full version of men like me. He paused. You weren't responding to a threat. You were responding to a story. One that's been written long before you ever put on that badge. You just played your part. Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was necessary. I read your file, Elias said. You've served over a decade. No excessive force reports. Clean record. Commendations for community work. I believe you're not a bad cop, Rylance. But good men can still do harm if they never stop to question what they've been told to fear. Rylance sat back, the weight of those words pressing into his chest. I've never sat across from someone like you, he said. I mean, someone who wasn't yelling. Someone who could have ended my career with one phone call, but chose this instead. Elias met his eyes. I chose this because I believe in accountability. Not punishment for punishment's sake. You could have been any officer. And I've been in your rearview before. Just never with cuffs on. Not until yesterday. Rylance opened his mouth, then closed it. I'm sorry, he said finally. Not just for the arrest, but for what it revealed about me. About how I think. I don't want to be that kind of officer. I believe that, Elias said. Which is why I asked the chief to create something new out of this mess. What do you mean? I want you to help build a training program, Elias said. With me. A curriculum for unconscious bias. One that actually talks to officers, not at them. One that uses real scenarios, not hypothetical textbooks. Rylance stared at him, disbelief and humility flickering behind his eyes. You want me to help? You're exactly the kind of person who should, Elias said. Because you've lived both sides of the mirror. That's where change begins. Not in policies. People. Rylance nodded slowly. I don't know if I deserve that chance. No one does, Elias said. But you've got it anyway. What you do with it. That's what matters now. They sat for a moment longer, the room still but charged with something rare. Mutual recognition. Not agreement. Not erasure of wrongdoing. But the beginning of something better. When Chief Haskins re-entered, her eyes moved between them, searching their faces for clues. Everything all right in here? She asked. Elias stood. Better than all right. It's a start. Outside, the sky was changing. San Francisco's fog had begun to pull back, revealing streaks of gold and deepening blue. The kind of sky that only appears after a storm has passed. Elias walked out of the precinct without handcuffs, without anger, but not without weight. Some burdens you carry not because they're yours, but because someone has to bear them long enough to turn them into something useful. Today, that burden felt a little lighter, because for the first time in a long while, someone on the other side had finally listened. The fallout didn't come as a bang. It arrived like a tide, quiet, steady, and undeniable. By the end of the week, the story had made its way to every major outlet. Federal agent wrongfully detained by local police, one headline read. Systemic bias strikes again, another declared. But what struck Elias Monroe the most wasn't the noise. It was the silence in between. The email from a black mother in Chicago who said her teenage son now walked to school a different route. The handwritten letter from an elderly white veteran in Maine, who admitted he'd never thought about how trust works differently depending on who you are. Elias read every word. He didn't speak to the press, not once. He refused every morning show, every podcast invitation, every panel appearance. Not because he didn't have something to say, but because he knew that sometimes restraint made a louder point than outrage. What mattered now wasn't the coverage. It was the consequence. The San Francisco Police Department released a public statement acknowledging the incident. They didn't spin it. They didn't bury it. They called it what it was, a failure. But they didn't stop there. Chief Dana Haskins announced a departmental audit of all recent stops made based on suspicious behavior to examine potential patterns of racial bias. She invited Elias to be part of a community-led oversight committee, and not just as a token gesture, but as a partner. Elias accepted. In the following weeks, changes that had once been deemed too ambitious began quietly unfolding. Officers in the department were now required to complete quarterly anti-bias training, with role-play scenarios modeled not from vague hypotheticals, but real-life incidents, including Elias's. But perhaps the most unexpected development came from within the federal ranks. The Bureau asked Elias to lead a new internal initiative, the TRUST Protocol. It stood for Tactical Response Under Societal Tension, a new framework designed to train federal agents on how to interact with local authorities, especially when race, power, and identity could distort perception. Elias didn't hesitate. He was tired of being a case study. He wanted to be a blueprint. He began traveling, quietly, without fanfare, to precincts across the country. Miami, Baltimore, St. Louis, Minneapolis. He sat in fluorescent-lit rooms with officers who crossed their arms at first, skeptical and silent. And then, he told them the story. Not to shame, but to invite reflection. He'd start with the facts: a park, a book, a bench, a man in uniform approaching. Then he'd pause and ask, "At what point in this story did your concern kick in?" The answers always revealed more than the question. But Elias never scolded. He guided. He knew change didn't happen with a single lecture. It happened in the slow erosion of old narratives. It happened when officers began to see their own blind spots and asked, without prompting, "How do I undo this?" The trust protocol spread faster than anyone expected. Not because it was mandatory, but because it made sense. It gave people language for a problem they'd tiptoed around for years. And still, Elias kept his own circle small. He returned home to Oakland when he could, where his father's jazz records still played from the old stereo, and where his mother, who had lived through her own history of being silenced, watched him now with quiet pride. "You never raised your voice," she told him once, "but you changed the conversation." Elias smiled, but didn't reply. Some things didn't need words. And then, something unexpected happened. One evening, Elias received a call from Officer Rylance, not from a station phone, not in any official capacity, but from his personal cell. "I just wanted to say thank you," Rylance said, "for not turning your back on the process, for letting me learn instead of burning me down." Elias listened. "There's this rookie in my unit now," Rylance continued, "and I caught myself teaching him how to stop making assumptions before they harden into belief. I sounded like you. That's the point, right?" Elias said only one thing in response. "That's the beginning." But change wasn't just happening behind precinct walls. Elias began noticing it in the small ways the public responded. At airports, he'd overhear passengers talking about that agent who got arrested and started a reform program. At a coffee shop in Atlanta, a black teenager stopped him and whispered, "They listen to me different now." He didn't need an award. That was the reward. And yet, what moved Elias most wasn't the headlines or policy shifts. It was the fact that the story had reached people who weren't even in law enforcement. Teachers using it to spark conversations in classrooms. Pastors folding it into sermons. Parents telling it at the dinner table, not to stir fear, but to plant awareness. That was when Elias realized something important. What happened to him in that park wasn't just an injustice. It was an ignition. It reminded people that the systems we live within are not immovable. That accountability isn't vengeance. That dignity can be disruptive. And that silence, when chosen, can roar. He began writing essays, reflections, even poetry. Not under his name, not for attention, but for legacy. He called the series The Gray Space, a tribute to the moments between assumption and understanding, between fear and truth. One night, while writing alone in his apartment, Elias paused and looked out the window. The city skyline shimmered under the moonlight, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear a siren wail, fading as it moved on. He closed his eyes and thought back to that afternoon. The sun in the park, the weight of the cuffs, the voice that accused, and the silence that followed. He no longer carried anger, only memory, only purpose. Elias Monroe hadn't set out to change policing in America. He'd only wanted to read in peace. But when that peace was taken, he'd built something better in its place. Not by burning down the room, but by inviting people to see it differently. And now, slowly, they were. It wasn't until Elias stood in front of that auditorium that he realized how far the echoes of one afternoon had truly traveled. The invitation had come quietly, slipped into his inbox between bureau memos and logistics updates. Subject line: Keynote invitation, Harvard Kennedy School graduation, Department of Public Leadership. At first, he considered declining. His story had already moved through the press cycle, into policy, into practice. But something about the way the letter was worded, the sincerity of the dean's voice, the acknowledgement not just of what had happened to him, but what he had chosen to do with it, made him pause. And now here he was, standing behind a podium, facing hundreds of graduates, professors, families. The room was bright, but Elias's presence, as always, radiated quiet gravity. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. "When I joined the bureau," he began, "I believed that change would come from position, from rank, title, influence. I thought if I just climbed high enough, did everything right, the system would treat me right in return. But I was wrong. The system doesn't recognize your resume. It recognizes your reflection." The room held its breath. What happened to me didn't begin in a park. It began long before, through decades of silent assumptions, unspoken fears, unchecked power. That park was just where it caught up with me. He let the pause settle in. But what I've learned since is this: the most powerful change doesn't begin with policy. It begins with presence, with what you tolerate in silence, what you challenge in a hallway conversation, what you say when it's your colleague, your friend, your supervisor who steps out of line. There was no need for dramatics. His words didn't demand attention. They earned it. Outside, reporters waited by the gates. Inside, no one moved. He continued, "We often think of justice as something big, something you march for, vote for, debate over. But sometimes justice is smaller. Sometimes it's as quiet as choosing not to look away." When he finished, the applause didn't burst. It built. From one corner, then another, until the entire auditorium stood. It wasn't just recognition. It was reverence. Later, as Elias slipped out a side entrance into the crisp Boston air, he was greeted by a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, dressed in the school's robes. "You probably don't remember me," she said, nervous but earnest. "But you spoke at my high school years ago, about bias and perception. I wrote my college essay about that. I just wanted to say thank you." Elias smiled and shook her hand. No, thank you. You're the reason this work matters. Encounters like that had become more frequent. Not because he was a celebrity, but because he was a symbol. Not of perfection, but of possibility. Back in Oakland, his life had found a rhythm again. He still worked with the Bureau, but now he also consulted for community safety programs, advised municipal task forces, and helped train police cadets across the country. Not just on tactics, but on humanity. But the biggest shift wasn't in his workload. It was in his perspective. Elias had begun mentoring young agents, particularly those who felt like outsiders in their own institutions. He listened more than he spoke. He didn't give them all the answers. Instead, he helped them ask better questions. One afternoon, he sat with a rookie agent named Isaiah, who had been struggling with an assignment in rural Alabama. "They don't take me seriously," Isaiah said, voice tinged with bitterness. "I walk into a room, and it's like they're just waiting for me to prove I don't belong." Elias nodded, understanding the weight of every unspoken word. "You don't fight that by performing," he told him. "You fight it by remembering that you're not there to be accepted. You're there to be excellent. Excellence speaks, even when people don't want to hear it." It was the kind of advice Elias wished someone had given him years ago. He knew now that the greatest legacy wouldn't be his rank or his accolades. It would be the people who moved differently, because they saw him move first. The officers who slowed down instead of reaching for control. The students who chose public service not just out of ambition, but out of conviction. The men and women who sat on benches in parks and didn't feel like suspects in their own skin. That, to him, was the quiet revolution. He hadn't needed to become a martyr. He had simply refused to stay small. On the anniversary of the incident, Elias returned to the same park in San Francisco. He walked slowly, taking in the familiar sights, the trees, the fountain, the children laughing in the distance. He found the bench, sat down. This time, no one approached him. No questions, no glares. Just space. Just air. A man walked by with his daughter and nodded politely. Elias nodded back. He opened a book. Not as a statement, just because he wanted to read. For the first time in a long time, he felt what had once been taken from him. Peace. Behind him, the city moved forward. But in that moment, Elias Monroe sat still, a man who had turned injustice into invitation, who had faced down the machinery of perception not with anger, but with unshakable clarity. And in doing so, he didn't just write a story, he rewrote the rules, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been mistaken, overlooked, dismissed. Because real power, he had come to understand, doesn't need permission. It just needs to be lived. And now, others were living it too. Elias Monroe's story is not just a tale about injustice. It's a profound reflection of what it means to navigate the world as a black man in America, even when you carry the highest credentials and serve in the most prestigious institutions. From the moment he was wrongfully arrested in a public park, a space meant for peace, reflection, and freedom, to the realization of his identity as a top-tier FBI agent, his journey peeled back the layers of unconscious bias, systemic profiling, and the painful truth that success does not always shield you from prejudice. But what makes Elias's story unforgettable isn't just what happened to him. It's how he responded. He didn't lash out. He didn't erupt in rage. Instead, he embodied what real power looks like. Measured, intentional, and deeply rooted in dignity. He allowed the truth to speak for itself. And when the system that had wronged him tried to patch things up behind closed doors, he chose transparency. He turned personal humiliation into a public turning point. Elias didn't stop at seeking justice for himself. He leveraged that moment to inspire change on a national level, advising law enforcement departments, mentoring young officers and agents, and shaping policy to protect others who might not have the voice or platform he did. Through it all, he remained grounded in a quiet truth. Respect should never be conditional. It should never depend on your job title, your wardrobe, or your proximity to power. The lesson we take from Elias Monroe's story is deeply relevant today. In a world where assumptions are made in seconds, where biases linger in boardrooms and sidewalks alike, we must learn to pause, to ask better questions, to resist the urge to define people by the categories we're comfortable with. Elias teaches us that we don't change hearts by yelling louder. We change them by showing up fully, fearlessly, and with unwavering integrity. So, what can we do? We start by noticing. By standing up when we witness injustice, even in subtle forms. By building systems, in our workplaces, our communities, our schools, that affirm worth instead of questioning it. And most importantly, by modeling the same quiet strength Elias did. Not asking for recognition, but walking with so much truth that the world has no choice but to recognize you. If this story moved you, if Elias's journey made you think differently, feel deeply, or reflect on your own experiences, then don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Let it start conversations in your homes and offices. And if you want to help us continue creating stories that matter, real stories, powerful stories, hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us keep telling the truths that too often go unheard. We're not here to make noise. We're here to make meaning. And we're just getting started.